When last we were talking about the course of World War I, we had mentioned and talked about the Western Front and how the Western Front was a stalemate war, ravaged by the destructive force of trench warfare. The Eastern Front, which was fought between Germany, mainly between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, was a much different war. It had much different tactics. It had much different geographic outcomes, and it had much different implications for the course of the war. Let's take a look at the map here to get into what we want to show you with some of the interesting things about World War I on the Eastern Front. Notice the differences, first of all, on this map between the Western fronts and the Eastern fronts. There will be a guaranteed question on the final exam going over what do you think are the major differences between Western and Eastern fronts in World War I? Okay, that's a guaranteed question, so you can start to set up your notes and get some W's and some things going on that, where you're trying to talk about the differences between the Western Front, remember, which was fought between France, Great Britain, Germany, and then eventually the United States will come in on the Western Front and push that over this way. But take a look at how little territory, how little geographic difference there was between the start of the Western Front and the conclusion of the Western Front here out west in this area. Out east, you're looking at huge swaths of nearly 1,000 miles of territory, whereas in the West, you had just, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of men fighting over hundreds of yards in that bloody conflict. So out in the Eastern Front, you can see from this purple line that the German advance by the end of the war, all right, had begun to push Russia almost back to its capital of Moscow. This red line right here is where the Russians were able to advance to at the beginning of the war. And remember, the reason that the Russians were able to advance this far at the beginning of the war, as it says here in 1914-15, is because most of the German troops were out here with the Schlieffen Plan trying to knock France out of the war quickly. Well, that enabled these Russian troops to flood into this area, and they were able to get pretty far into German and Austro-Hungarian territory. However, the Russian troops were so poorly trained, so poorly equipped, and they were rushed into battle that they were not able to handle the professional soldiers of Germany and Austria-Hungary once they were able to get back to the Eastern Front and begin to fight Russia in quote-unquote normal battlefield. The Russians began to lose massive amounts of territory back into their countries, you can see here, over the course of the next couple years. Until, guys, in 1918, the Russians will undergo, and your chapter talks about this with its readings, the Russians will undergo a complete social revolution. They will overthrow their king, their czar. They will put in essentially a new political and economic system called communism. And the Russians will run essentially as the Soviet Union until 1990. They will become that union of Soviet Socialist republics for the next 70 years. In this case, guys, what the most interesting thing about World War I on the Eastern Front is that Germany wins. Germany wins the Eastern Front. Russia sues for peace and gets out of town. They have to get back to their capital city, and they're undergoing a social revolution. So in this case, guys, Germany wins all of this territory from Russia out here. And so when we get to the end of the war, the Germans are perplexed as to why what they feel is their territory that they have won here from the Russians is ripped away from them by the Allies. And it is. When the war ends, the Allied powers will take all of that land that Germany felt that it won fair and square from Russia. And what will happen is, and we'll see this on the map in a little bit, they will kind of redistribute this land that used to be Russia that Germany won, and they'll create all kinds of new territories out of it, and territories that will begin to be tugged and pulled on by both Russia and Germany over the course of the next 25, 30, 40 years as the Iron Curtain of Russia grows. And as Germany attempts to recover from 2 world wars. But that's the interesting thing, guys, from this slide is that Germany wins the war in the East. They beat the Russians in the East, and they had that territory then ripped from them at the peace talks. When we get to those here in a little bit, we'll talk about that. Again, last thing to reemphasize is how little territorial exchange happened in the Western Front and how much territorial exchange happened in the Eastern Front. Why did the war end? A bunch of different reasons. The United States entry into the war was a huge factor, without a doubt. The United States entry into the war made the Western Front extremely lopsided in terms of soldiering and in terms of the fact that the United States was just able to push over these depleted German troops in 1918. Why were they depleted? Well, guys, how about this for a timely subject? The 1918 flu pandemic, sometimes called the Spanish flu, even though it didn't originate in Spain, but it's sometimes called the Spanish flu. The 1918 influenza pandemic, which ravaged, massively depleted the armies on both fronts, but especially the Western Front, ripped through in the fall of 1918. It began in kind of like this COVID situation that we're going through. It began to show its face in late spring of 1918, then kind of subsided over the summer and then came back. It mutated and came back with a vengeance in the fall of 1918. Right now, I'd like you to, if you can, pause this presentation here, and I've linked on our email that I sent you and the Canvas page on the website. I've linked a really interesting and very timely article about the 1918 flu pandemic, how much it interestingly is mirroring what's happening today, but also in the fact that it's not mirroring it at all. That we kind of are learning our lesson from the past. There were no quarantines in 1918. Governments refused to, quote unquote, shut down during 1918 because, well, of course, we were fighting a war. So you can't really shut the government down. You can't really shut the economy down when you're fighting a war. So all these different types of things led to really ugly return of this flu pandemic in the fall of 1918, which in essence ended the war. But you can see from the pictures here, you got the masks going on. You got people if you can put color to these images, these would look strikingly similar to some images that you see going on around the world today. At the 11th hour of the 11th month in 1918, the war ended. You can see from some of these snippets that we found from different types of newspapers from around the country, still going with the very, kind of ugly ethnic terms, calling the other side the Huns, but the Huns give up. And the armistice is signed and the guns fall silent on November 11th at 11 a.m. 1918. Everybody now has to try and put the world back together again. And as you, hopefully you getting into in your chapter that we asked and talked about on Monday, what starts to happen in the aftermath of the war is that the Germans are going to be penalized heavily for what is being deemed by the Allied side as German aggression. The Germans were labeled as the warmongers. They were labeled as the ones who started it all. And it was going to be Germany and Austria-Hungary to a degree, but mostly Germany, who were going to pay the war reparations. What happened in this war? What were the final totals if we start to look at some of these staggering battlefield casualties? One of the things, guys, that's very noticeable about World War I in comparison to World War II. And like I said, I wish we could get to World War II, but we lost that, week and a half to 2 weeks around midterm when we pivoted to remote learning. But it's okay. But one of the things that's really interesting and noteworthy about World War I in comparison to World War II is the differences between battlefield and civilian casualties between the two wars. In World War I, there were relatively, in comparison to World War II, few civilian casualties. This was a battlefield war. This was a war fought mainly between soldiers on the fronts. In World War II, you're going to get huge numbers of civilian casualties with just unscrupulous kind of carpet bombing of cities that we saw with the Nazis in London and all throughout England, and then the Allies just sort of carpet bombing cities all throughout Germany, which is going to lead to massive amounts of civilian casualties, not the least of which were the 12, 13 million people killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust. That Jewish Holocaust was a massive civilian casualty situation. World War I battlefield casualties are much higher than we get in World War II. Another reason why World War I battlefield casualties are so much higher than World War II is because the medical field was not nearly as advanced as it's going to be in World War II. Battlefield nurses, stations, the ability to knock out infections early, those types of things are all going to be better in World War II. Also, by World War II, there was an agreement, amazingly, between the sides to not use the types of gases that were used in World War I, the mustard gases, the sarin gases, which led to massive amounts of battlefield casualties. In total, you have nearly 30 million. In some cases, some estimates put it at higher than 30 million men and women, mostly men, dying on the battlefield of World War I. The Russians lost over 9 million men in battle. That's an unfathomable total. That doesn't comprehend to reality, to think about 9 million people being killed in the course of three and a half years. Again, why are Russia's losses so great? As you look at the bottom right hand of the screen, couple reasons for this. Russia's troops were poorly trained. They were poorly equipped. They were not ready for a modern war. They were more trained to fight the Napoleonic Wars of the early 1800s. They did not have proper battlefield clothing. They were not equipped properly with guns. They were not trained properly. And Russia just simply kept throwing men and women, no matter the age, no matter their physical situation, just threw them into the battle to be slaughtered. Over 9 million people in total lost their lives from Russia during World War I. So again, you want to know why Russia has a social revolution, why Russia completely flips itself upside down. Well, you lose 9 million people in a couple of years, your society's not going to be doing very well. Germany loses upwards a little bit more than 7 million men on the battlefield. Again, a staggering total. Austria-Hungary, very similar, 7 million. So in essence, in the middle of Europe, you have 14 million men that have lost their lives on the battlefield. France, over 6 million battlefield casualties. Great Britain, over 3 million. So you can see, as you get further away from the fronts, you're going to get less and less casualties. Great Britain with over 3 million, which is still an unbelievably high number. And then you see Italy coming in at over 2 million battlefield casualties. The Ottoman Empire, aka Turkey, with around 1 million. And then way down here at the bottom, you get the United States with, we'll look at some numbers on the next slide with the total amount of battlefield casualties for the United States. Why is the United States number so low? Well, of course, we didn't enter into the war until its final stages in the summer of 1918, going into the fall of 1918. So the United States clearly lost the least amount of soldiers in World War I. The American Battlefield Cemetery is located at the Somme, which is a battlefield in France, which you can visit. In total, the United States had 205,000 soldiers, plus nurses, other types of Red Cross volunteers wounded in World War I. A total of 63,000 deaths caused by disease and other causes, and then 53,000 killed in action. So you're looking at, like I said, a total of, if you put all those numbers together, you're looking at about 300,000 plus people that were either killed in action, died from disease, flu, pandemic, and other causes. Things like trench foot and gangrene and all that disgusting things that couldn't be cured on the battlefield, and then 205,000 wounded. A big number, certainly, to be sure. But not, again, the United States, in comparison to other places, which you saw in the last chart, not nearly as dear in terms of numbers. The Treaty of Versailles is what happens in the aftermath of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, again, Versailles, just about 10 miles outside of Paris, France, a very famous place. And you get this Treaty of Versailles that's signed by all sides in 1919. And you can see from this map, you can start to see there's the Soviet Union on the map, okay, for the first time. But also what starts to happen is new places, and we'll talk about this at a later map, which is towards the end of our discussion today. New places start to pop up on the map, including places like Poland, Czechoslovakia. We'll look at some of those areas here in a minute. But again, Germany feels completely stabbed in the back here. The land that they felt that they won there in that pink color, and was what they felt taken from them. They felt that they had won that fair and square from the Russians, and it was taken away from them. And the Germans are not going to forget what they feel is a really punitive and unfair penalty levied on them at the Treaty of Versailles. At this point, it would be awesome if you could pause the notes and go and watch that linked video on Woodrow Wilson and his presidency and the course of World War I from an American perspective, because that's going to begin to bring up the things that we read about in this chapter, but also that I've asked you to think about throughout the course of this situation is, what is the Americans' role? What are we going to do during the war? What do we do after the war? Woodrow Wilson and many within his Democratic Party in the government of the United States wanted a sort of an overarching governing body that would, in essence, try and stop war from happening ever again. And this was discussed in depth at the Treaty of Versailles. This league, this super league of nations, as it began to be called, the League of Nations, was Woodrow Wilson's dream of attempting to make world peace something that was achievable and to make war something that could never happen again. The problem is, as we've talked about this, the American public, as soon as that war ends, the American public wants out. The American public wants nothing to do with being a kind of world police, or doesn't want anything to do with this League of Nations, which gets branded by many in the United States, in the opposing party to Wilson, as it would be entrapping the United States in some sort of world global government, which you start to, even today, start saying, terms like globalism, global government, those types of things, like a global tax, or, a global court that could pass laws that would, be applicable over American citizens. Many Americans, including myself, all things being disclosed, bristle at that. You're like, I don't really like that. Somebody on the other side of the world could pass a law that would apply to me here. But like I said, everybody's got different opinions on that type of thing. But this was a global League of Nations, and the American public simply, the vast majority of the American public, it wasn't even a party thing. It was just the vast majority of American public, both Democrats and Republicans, were like, no, thank you, on this League of Nations. We're going to go back to being isolated. We're going to put up our boundaries again. And that's why I love these cartoons here. So hopefully you have viewed that video, the first 13 minutes of that video. If you haven't, please do it now, and then come back and we'll look at these cartoons here about this situation. You can see from the cartoon on the left that it has the foreign nations, European nations, even Japan, England over here, holding Uncle Sam's hands behind his back. And the United States is being sort of tied down by this world global government, as it was being labeled. And the one on the right is interesting too, as you can see Uncle Sam reclining there, and he's unwilling to put the keystone, the last part of that bridge, in place between the not United Nations, but the League of Nations. Was designed by the President of the United States, as it says up there, designed by the President of the United States. The United States is the gap in this bridge right here, and we are refusing to put our stone in. We're not going to do it. And the League of Nations ultimately fails. And hopefully you watched that from the video that was linked on Canvas. Page 867 talks about this. The League of Nations never got off the ground. It was attempted. It worked for a little bit, but without American input, without American military strength behind it, the League of Nations was an utter failure from its very beginning. America returns to its isolationist foreign policy. As you can see here, the United States and Mexico, for that matter as well, refuses to join this League of Nations. And you can see from the map key at the bottom, you have founding members, you have admitted members, non-members, those types of things. So again, the big aspect of that is that Woodrow Wilson and many of these progressive-minded individuals literally thought that they could stop war from happening. It was a very, very, very idealistic dream, and one that we know today is, I don't know, it's probably something that can't be done. You probably are not going to be able to stop war from happening. It's always going to pop up from time to time. But the idealists, in this case, Woodrow Wilson was a progressive idealist, literally thought that they could end war if everybody just got together in this gigantic League of Nations. The Treaty of Versailles, and I want to take a look at this map here for a minute, from Germany's perspective, just absolutely crushes Germany. in terms of geographic territory lost, in terms of economic power lost. Germany is heavily penalized and made to pay massive amounts of reparations during the aftermath of World War I. The big thing I want you to focus on this slide is looking right here in the middle at this chart of percentages. Germany is penalized 100% of their colonial possessions. So anything that Germany had in Africa, anything that Germany had overseas, anything that Germany had possession-wise in Southeast Asia was all gone. It was all gobbled up and redistributed amongst the Allied powers. Now, again, don't think that the Allied powers are going to do anything, amazingly nice, like give those German colonies their freedom. That certainly is not going to happen. Those possessions are going to be then divided amongst the Allies, and now they are going to control those places colonially. So they're not going to do anything, like I say, crazy, like, hey, how about we give those people their freedom and let them run their own country? No, that's not going to happen during this time period. Germany also loses 80% of its navy. Its naval power is completely destroyed. 48%, so basically 50% of every piece of iron that is produced in Germany is then gobbled up and taken by Allied powers. Germany is penalized 50% of its iron production, 16% of its coal production. Whatever Germany produces in terms of coal power, which was growing as a means of power production during this time period, 16% of that goes as kind of a loan payment to the Allied powers. Germany loses 13% of its geographic capabilities, its geographic extent. And the big parts that Germany was really most upset about that they lost was down here in the territories of Alsace-Lorraine and around the Rhine River. Why? Because these areas are like the breadbasket for Germany. This would be like the United States losing, its breadbasket territories. It would be like if somebody came in and just sort of carved out the entire Midwest from the United States and said, well, good luck producing corn and livestock and wheat and cereal and all that stuff. Germany is simply unable to produce at the level it was able to prior to the war. And this is going to lead to all kinds of social, economic, political disruptions in Germany during the 1920s. And of course, we all know the end result of what happens at the end of the 1920s. Germany will turn into a fascist dictatorship, which will take over in very nationalistic terms the entire country of Germany. And it all kind of starts with these types of pieces of propaganda, as you can see right here. These pieces of propaganda began to be seen all throughout Germany in the 1920s. At the top, translated out of its German, it says lost but not forgotten land. And you can see those territories outlined in red here. Well, we just talked about the territories of the Rhine River, territories that were taken, what they felt was taken from them after they won it from the Russians out in the east. And so Germany feels like these are lost, but they're not forgotten lands. We will get them back at some point. We just have to build ourselves back up. Lots of German soldiers who fought in World War I felt that they were stabbed in the back, that they were not stuck up for by their German government. And so everybody during the 1920s in Germany begins to call for new governments. They begin to want a government that would stand up, what they feel would stand up for their national heritage and make them strong again. One of those very upset German soldiers is right there. His mustache looks a little different, but you can see in there, you can kind of start to look at his face and wonder who that is. Well, of course, that's German soldier Adolf Hitler. His mustache was a little longer during World War I. He will eventually shave that mustache into the prototypical Hitler mustache. which we all know him from in the 1920s and 30s. But Hitler was one of those millions of disgruntled German soldiers who was saying to themselves, we're going to get them back. We're going to get those people back for taking our land and making us this a terrible place that Germany felt that the Allies made it in the aftermath of World War I. Basically, guys, here's where we end up. The Treaty of Versailles tries to reconstruct Europe in a way that they hope will not produce future wars. They could not have been more wrong in the aftermath of history. Of course, it's always easy to look back in history. Hindsight's always 20/20. But what they begin to do is they begin to create and carve out of German and Austro-Hungarian territory and even former Russian territory. They begin to carve out all these new countries that come about and are seen on the map, in some cases for the first time, in some cases for the first time in hundreds of years. Poland, for example, reappears on the map for the first time in Europe in a couple hundred years. Czechoslovakia is a territory that is carved out of Austria and Hungary and sort of given a new ethnic group, not new ethnic group, but a new country is carved out for an ethnic group known as the Czechs, and the Slovaks are able to have their own country. Hungary's territory is severely reduced. You get a new country down here called Yugoslavia, all right? Yugoslavia, again, we talked about the Slavic ethnicity being present in and around that region, which many people felt was the trigger that started the war down there in Serbia. And then lastly but not leastly, out here in the Middle East, you can see that Britain and France take possessions away from the Ottoman Empire. They take possession away from Turkey. France takes Syria, all right, and Great Britain takes control of Iraq and Jordan. To this very day, when disturbances arise in Iraq, you can be for sure that Britain is going to want to have its say in those situations. When things arise in Syria, France is always going to be seen as coming to the defense of the Syrians. Why is that? Why does things like that happen? People ask those questions like, well, you know, why is France so involved with things in Syria? Well, guys, it goes back 100 years. It goes back to the aftermath of World War I, when France was in essence given possession of Syria to run as a colonial power, and Britain the same thing with Iraq. That brings to a close our notes